Hey everyone, welcome to another week of Ecology Lab, and today we're going to be talking about my favorite topic in ecology. I'm absolutely biased, but I do think that predation is one of the coolest things we're going to cover this semester, so I'm excited to dive into this today. But before we get started, it's kind of important to think about like two different ways we can kind of conceptualize how things are structured within an ecosystem, and that's top-down versus bottom-up structure. So when we talk about top down, we're talking about it's consumer driven. So when we say consumer, it's organisms eating other organisms. And thinking of it as like the higher levels of the food chain are kind of controlling the lower levels. So the behavior of the top levels of the food chain will really kind of dictate what happens through the rest of the ecosystem. As opposed to the bottom up, is when it's really producer driven. So primary productivity and the nutrient supply really provide the foundation that set the limits for the rest of the ecosystem. So thinking about plankton and other kind of primary producers are really sort of the foundation that like if they're not in producing much, then it's gonna have wild ripple effects throughout the rest of the trophic web. So most systems have both top-down and bottom-up influences. But today, when we talk about predation, we're really going to be focusing on these sort of top-down influences on the structure of an ecosystem. So last week, we talked about these sort of functional responses when it comes to predator or prey abundance and predators. So remember that there's a couple of different functional responses based on as the density of prey populations. So as prey populations increase, we can either see the number of prey consumed increase kind of equally, like in type 1. We can see it increase and then start to decrease once we get towards this sort of certain threshold of the number of prey that can be consumed based on the handling time, which is type 2. And then type 3 would be we see this in kind of low levels at low consumption levels at low prey density, and then at intermediate prey density that really increases, and then at top prey densities you see that decrease again. But so to think about predation, it's actually the definition is when one organism consumes another organism, and the one doing the eating is the predator, and the one being eaten is the prey. So to think about this in terms of kind of the pros and cons of species interactions, predation is when one species benefits and the other species loses. So the predator benefits, and obviously the prey, or the one that's getting eaten, is losing. This is kind of in context of other kind of organism interactions where one is mutualism, where they both benefit. An example would be like coral polyps and zooxanthellae. So corals have this mutualist relationship with photosynthetic algae where they both win. The algae gives them food and the coral polyps provide shelter. So that's mutualistic. They're both winning. Or commensalism is one organism benefits and the other one is just not affected. And that can be, an organism that what's a good example of commensalism? Like lives on a whale and the whale isn't like affected by it, but then the organism like a barnacle gets to kind of chill and not be eaten. So that's commensalism, mutualism. But what we're talking about is this really disproportionate relationship where one species benefit and one does not. And there's a couple types of predation, and the one that we're really familiar with is when we're talking about carnivores. So animals eating other animals, right? Sharks and seals, or wolves and deer, or what have you. It's not totally intuitive, but another type of predation is herbivory. So when an animal eats a plant, and there's lots of examples of this, sea turtles eating seagrass or deer eating grass. We don't really think of herbivores as predators typically, but that is technically a type of predation because you have one organism consuming another organism. Another example that is technically a type of predation, it's kind of in its own category, is parasitism. So when an organism will not eat another organism, but like take resources from one to survive. So, there's lots of really gnarly parasites out there if you want to get into it. I will say my personal favorite parasite is this type of parasite that will actually it's an isopod that will eat away a fish's tongue and actually take the place of the fish's tongue, so that when the fish eats, the parasite eats. And that is just one of the super fun facts that you get to learn from me being your TA. But if you are interested in parasites, you could really go down a rabbit hole into all the like wild ways that parasites will take resources from their prey. But we're not going to talk too much about parasites today. So let's break down the types of consumers. So when we talk about the types of consumers, we're really talking about like the types of food they're going to be going after. So when we talk about generalists or opportunistic feeders, it's predators that can consume a really wide range of prey. And there's a lot of advantages to this, right? So if you are a consumer that maybe has like big variability in your prey availability, that means that you are happy eating a lot of different things. You can get your nutrients from a lot of different places. And that can be also really helpful in a system that the climate's really variable. So if you get like big ranges in temperature, maybe one of your preferred prey will die, but you can like be perfectly happy eating something else. You also have specialists or predators that really just focus on a couple of types of food to get the majority of their nutrients. So, you hear about it with koalas, for example, they eat eucalyptus leaves. Like the specialist might kind of seem like a not super great evolutionary strategy, because you're like, well, what if, a big wildfire comes through and kills all of your food? Like, that's a good question. But there are actually some kind of interesting advantages to being a specialist. There was a study that looked in like the amount of energy and time it takes for a generalist to decide whether or not to eat something. So it actually takes kind of more resources to think about like, should I eat this thing or should I not eat this thing? Whereas a specialist, you've got like one job. You're like, I know I want to eat this thing. So it's actually really easy to focus on trying to put all of your energy into eating that one type of prey. So how do predators shape ecosystems? How does that top-down kind of process work? So really the primary way is that they limit the amount of prey through eating them or through not eating them, which is not totally intuitive, because consumptive effects, directly eating them, that makes sense. But non-consumptive effects kind of take a couple of different forms. So consumptive effects, so that's when a predator will actually just eat the prey. A change in prey density that's solely due to the predators attacking and eating the prey. And this is also called a lethal effect because the prey dies upon eating it. But this is kind of the thing that we think about most about predator eating prey, right? So this bird eating this fish, that's a gnarly photo, the lion eating the carcass of whatever, right? We're directly consuming it. But that's not the only way they can affect prey populations. Non-consumptive effects are the effects that a predator has on their prey by not actually eating them. This is also called a risk effect. So this is when an animal will actually make a decision that will change their behavior to avoid predators. So, and the effort that's allocated to this anti-predator behavior will actually cost the animal a benefit, such as foraging or reproductive opportunities. So an example of this would be like, all right, you've got a chipmunk that really wants to go travel across this big empty field and eat from this tree that has a lot of really good food of whatever chipmunks eat, nuts or whatever. And they have, by running across this field, they're much more open to potentially being attacked by predators. So they are less likely to run across the field, or they're going to do it much faster, or they're going to do it only at nighttime. And all of those things might take more energy because it means that they're not able to get the food exactly when they want if they have to wait to a certain time of day, or they have to expend a lot more energy to get to the foraging spot. So all of these are instances of how the prey will change their behavior solely on the threat of being eaten by the predators. And then combine these impacts of consumptive and non-consumptive effects can be seen in these prey species, and then in turn will actually alter the structure of the food web. So these are similar to consumptive and non-consumptive, but they're actually different. So the direct effects are the influences of one species has directly on another species without being mediated or transmitted through the third party. So these direct effects can be consumptive or non-consumptive, right? So the predator will directly affect the behavior of that prey item or the survival if it's direct consumption. An indirect effect is when one species will affect another species through a third party. So an example of that would be like, you've got a shark that will eat a dolphin that will then, eat a smaller fish. And an indirect effect could be like, because of the threat of the sharks, the dolphins are less likely to spend time foraging for these other fish. And then that fish population actually has less threat of a dolphin, right? So these are sort of thinking multiple steps throughout the food web. You might have these kind of indirect effects from this predation relationship. So when we think about how like a predator might affect their prey, which might affect their prey, we can think of that in terms of a trophic cascade, which is a particularly strong indirect effect that can affect an entire community or ecosystem. So one of the really popular examples of a trophic cascade would be like, sea otters on the Pacific coast will eat urchins, and then urchins in turn eat kelp, like they will graze down kelp. So typically the sea otter populations will keep the urchins in check so they're not overgrazing the kelp. But there was an example, it was like a study by Estes, I think in the 70s, that like because of overfishing of certain killer whale prey, killer whales actually switched to eating sea otters. So then the sea otter populations really declined. And then we also had some pressure from fur harvest. So the sea otter populations declined, which means that they weren't eating as many urchins, which means that the urchin populations really skyrocketed. So there were tons more urchins than what was used to in the environment. And then those urchins just went to town on all the kelp and ate a ton of kelp. And so then we saw we saw decreased amounts of the kelp. Here, I'll show you here. So we've got this over harvesting of the fur industry and also this prey switching from the whales, and we see this negative effect. So we saw a decrease in the amount of the sea otters, and then we saw an increase in the amount of the urchins because the sea otters typically eat the urchins, and then because of that we saw a resulting decrease in the amount of kelp. So think of this as like 3 different tiers of the same trophic web, like the same food web. And by adjusting the population densities of that upper part of the food web, it has all of these ripple effects, these direct and indirect effects throughout the rest of the web. This is a really interesting study if you're interested in trophic cascades. I've got tons more examples for you. So there's also ways of like, if you want to get down this rabbit hole, there's all sorts of kind of iterations of looking at like indirect effects and if it's like behaviorally mediated or there's another one, but I can't remember at this exact time. But like for a behaviorally mediated indirect effect is when like a change in the species causes a behavioral shift in this other species, which in turn affects another species. So one of the examples in Shark Bay is that like the presence of sharks will actually change the presence of other species. So here we've got this these dugongs and tiger sharks and dolphins. So you've got this these animals that prefer shallow water habitats, and then when the tiger sharks are around, like the dolphins will actually go away because of these effects of the tiger shark being applying predation pressure. So this changes seasonally. I'll just read it instead of trying to explain it. Seasonal peaks in abundance of the dugongs and other tiger shark prey species like the dolphins will actually change where they forage. So when the tiger sharks are around, even though the dugongs and the dolphins like the shallow water habitats, they will actually move to reduce their use of those habitats because of the threat of predation, even though it means that they're not getting as good of food. This is just another example of predation risk. This is actually an experiment looking at like grasshopper density with this control system and if there is presence of predation spiders and risk spiders. So here we've got like this presence of a spider will decrease the amount of grasshoppers, which then decrease amounts of this grass. But then when we have increased amount of these spiders, we actually have even fewer number of these grasshoppers, which actually means that there's less predation on the grass, which means an increase in the amount of grass. So this is a concept that will come up all the time in ecology, and it comes up in competition, it comes up in predation, but it's this idea of trade-offs. So it's this idea that you have to give up something to get something else, right? So part of the concept of trade-offs is that animals are always trying to like survive and reproduce. Those are really the main things. Animals want to survive and they want to reproduce. So in order to survive, they need to get a bunch of nutrients, and they also need to not get eaten, right? So this idea of trade-offs is in the presence of predators. Foragers might have to face these trade-offs between getting energy and not getting eaten. So how do you get the most energy while reducing your amount of exposure to predators? So one type of that is splitting your time between foraging and keeping an eye out for predators. So if you think about it, if you are, a chipmunk foraging, if you have to be looking over your shoulder all the time for a potential predator, you're actually taking away from time you could be looking for food. So this vigilance costs a lot of energy and it costs a lot of time. If you always have to be looking over your shoulder, it's going to take you longer to get the same amount of nutrients. So deciding to forage in dangerous but productive habitats versus safer but less productive. So this is a trade-off between resource supply and predation risk. So say there's an area that has like the best food, but it also has a ton of predators. You might decide to go to an area that has food that's not as good because there's not as many predators. So you're doing this trade-off between like not as many resources, but fewer predation risk. Or you might decide your trade-off is to go to the area with more resources so you could decrease your foraging time. And so you might be able to get a bunch more in a short amount of time, even though for that short amount of time, you have more predation risk. How much food to remove from patches that vary in the risk of predation? So this is also called giving up density, and that essentially means like how much food do you get before you call it a day? So how much time do you spend foraging before you're like, I have to leave, so I'm not going to get eaten by a predator? When to cease foraging to flee from approaching predator. So this is flight initiation distance. So you might see a predator way off in the distance and you probably have time maybe to continue foraging. So it's about when do you make that decision between like, it's time for me to skedaddle, even if it might mean that I'm giving up food, right? How many individuals to forage with, or group size? So here's the instance of where there's safety in numbers, but it means that now you're actually competing with more people in your group potentially for those resources. So if you go to a place to forage, you might have this trade-off where you're like, well, because there's more animals foraging there, I might not be able to get as much, but because there's more there, I might be safer from predators. And then how quickly to move, when to forage, how long to forage. So like when do you do it during the day? How much energy do you put in there? Because remember, every bit of energy that you exert trying to get food is actually more food you have to get to replenish that energy. So there's a lot of kind of these trade-offs that go into these prey animals figuring out when they are going to forage. So in failing to balance these can of course be deadly. Like if you decide that you're gonna like wait a little longer before you flee and you make the wrong choice, that means that you're dinner. So, but it also on the flip side can mean that if you spend too much time looking for predators, then you're not gonna get enough food and you could starve. So it's this constant trade-off, and part of that it goes into this whole evolutionary ecology idea, right? If you do it wrong, you're going to get eaten and not be able to pass your genes on to the next generation. So when you think about all of these trade-offs, think about how it could go either way. So like if you flee too fast, you might lose access to that food and it costs a lot of energy to run. But if you don't flee fast enough, you're going to die. So all of these trade-offs, they have pros and cons. Here's an example. There's a study that looked at like all of these different iterations of what can happen in a predator-prey interaction. So we've got this encounter and it's literally like a flowchart. So either nothing happens or the prey sees the predator first, predator sees the prey first, and you kind of go down this line based on like when the predator chooses to attack or when the prey chooses to attack, who sees who first and whatnot. So this all kind of ties into this larger idea in ecology, which is the optimal foraging theory. So this is a way that scientists have kind of developed this idea where consumers can navigate this trade-off between eating or foraging and avoiding being eaten. So essentially the optimal foraging theory is like finding that sweet balance between all those trade-offs. It predicts that organisms will behave in a way that maximizes their food intake while minimizing their chances of being eaten. And this sounds like pretty straightforward, and it is. But it is this kind of theory that we can go back to when when we look at animal behavior and the choices that animals make. If we can tie it back to this optimal foraging theory, we can say, like, well, even if that doesn't necessarily make sense at the surface, if we look at it in context of this optimal foraging theory, we might be able to see like how that behavior might actually help them avoid being eaten and whatnot. So optimal foraging theory also predicts that there's this optimal flight response. So fleeing is really costly because it takes a lot of energy, and again, you're giving up this potential food intake. So it incorporates a couple of different components of flight, which is energetic cost of flight, how fast you're going, angle of the approach of the predator, distance to safety. All of these things can influence escape responses. So if you think about it, if you only have to travel to a tree that's right next to you, like if you're a bird that's like foraging on the ground, that like for safety you just have to like dart up to a tree branch that's really close, you might be willing to abort foraging much faster because you only have to go a short amount and it's really fast to go back to continue to forage in that area, right? Optimal foraging theory predicts that this flight initiation distance will be shorter, meaning that predators are allowed to get closer to you. When the costs of flight are high, the loom rate is lower, and the habitat characteristics favor easier escape. So, like that example I just said, that would be an easier escape. So you just don't have that far to go. But you might stay there longer if leaving is going to cause like a ton of energy. So I think the trade-offs are super fascinating. And if you kind of put animal behavior that you witness in terms of optimal foraging theory, it can kind of tell you quite a bit about how rare it is for animals to get certain calories. Like if an animal is going to like really, really wait a long time before they initiate flight, and flight is not just flying, right? It means that like traveling away from a predator, it could be that like that resource is really difficult to get. And so it's really interesting kind of in this longer context. So that's all I have for you today about predation. We've got actually a really cool simulation today when it comes to, you're going to kind of structure this wolf and sheep and kind of change different situations about initial abundance and kind of the resources they get and how fast they die off and whatnot. So I'm actually really excited about your thing today. So if you have any questions, of course, please email me and I will get back to you, but hopefully you enjoyed today. So thank you so much.